Okay, so I'm looking at the Star Wars subreddit, and the big question on there is which was Palpatine's most useful Sith apprentice? Here is the original post, and I'll read you some comments after that. Unpopular opinion, Count Dooku Darth Tyrannus was ironically his most important apprentice and tool out of the three. Despite that he was clearly never meant to be a true Sith successor, I'm pretty sure Sidious never intended on replacing him anyways. He was a key player in leading to the rise of the Sith through the Empire. Without Dooku to manage the clones, Zyphidius, the CIS, and the Clone War as he did, Palpatine would have never risen to power. Although Vader was as true as apprentice, he wasn't as key in my opinion. The Empire would have existed without him. Let me read some of these comments. I'd argue Dooku was essential to conquering the galaxy, whereas Anakin was a good to have, but not a must have when it came to dealing with the Jedi. I mean, at the end of the day, the Jedi were wiped out during Order 66 using the clone army that Dooku helped create. Anakin wasn't needed to purge the Jedi. His only contribution to the purge was killing a bunch of defenseless kids. He couldn't even kill Obi-Wan Kenobi, and instead ended up in a near-death state after their confrontation. He then spends the next couple of decades in the shadows serving as the Emperor's hitman and enforcer. He's not even lead on the Empire's biggest project, the Death Star. At the end of the day, for all the spiritual underpinnings of the Jedi versus Sith conflict, the war in Star Wars is fundamentally a political one, between an authoritarian empire and the rebels seeking to restore democracy. In this political context, someone like Dooku is a much more crucial piece of the puzzle. And here's a response to that. Palpatine basically kept Vader around because he needed a powerful apprentice who could do his dirty work and who'd be another one of his weapons. But his primary focus was on repression through military and law enforcement, total control through manipulation of the Senate, and ultimately the Death Star project. In the larger scheme of things, it's actually a little crazy how little the Jedi versus Sith conflict factored into the larger scope of things. Palpatine being a Sith Lord was almost incidental to him taking power. The likes of Obi-Wan, Yoda, and Luke eventually play important roles in the rebellion, but it's ultimately a much larger political and military movement against Palpatine's empire. The Jedi and Sith essentially cancel each other out as the final victory is achieved through a mostly conventional military campaign. Okay, so here's a pretty good comment. Let me read it. Each of them represents a different type of value for Palpatine in ways that I don't know are directly comparable, but Vader was undeniably the most valuable to Palpatine in regards to both his use and what he represented. Maul was truly intended as a successor. His value in the long term was arguably the most anticipated, surpassed only by Vader, as at this time Sidious seemed to be at his most devoted to the rule of two. But for his actual use, he was functionally just a glorified assassin and enforcer. He was closer to Ventress than to Dooku or Vader in application. The grand plan included him at first, but he's ultimately completely disposable and replaced within a literal day. Dooku was always meant to be replaced. You're completely right that he was never seen by Palpatine as a true successor to the mantle of Sith Master. His use to Palpatine extends before he was ever considered as a Sith apprentice. He had already commissioned the clones, killed Zyphidius, and wiped Kamino from the Jedi archives before he ever devoted himself truly to Sith ideology. His ability to be a useful tool and co-conspirator was not dependent on his role as a true Sith apprentice. However, his conversion did represent an ideological win for Palpatine. He was arguably the single greatest contributor to the Empire's founding outside of Palpatine himself. He was perhaps the most singularly useful tool Palpatine ever made use of, but this was not in any way related to his place as a Sith. And I'd still argue he was the least meaningful of Palpatine's apprentices from the point of view of Sith legacy. His role as CIS head of state and face of the war would have remained largely unchanged had Maul survived. He likely would have been marked for death at Maul's hands at the end of the war to launch the rise of the Empire all the same, in an alternative timeline where Maul survived and Anakin remains unknown. Vader was easily the most important apprentice in terms of overt role as a weapon of the Sith. Unlike his predecessors, there was no need for Vader to act from the shadows. He was the true fist of the Emperor and an extension of Palpatine's will. His sacking of the Jedi Temple was the single greatest victory of any of Palpatine's apprentices, both on a practical and ideological level. Vader's rise was Palpatine's greatest moment of devotion to the rule of two, even if he still planned on making Vader truly work for it with his experiments into immortality. Even in his failure on Mustafar, Vader's role was so critical he warranted saving. Palpatine would have made no similar efforts to restore a broken Maul on Naboo, even if he had sensed Maul's continued survival. Palpatine has made it abundantly clear in the comics that the early Empire only survived thanks to Vader's military genius and role as Palpatine's enforcer. Palpatine openly admitted he attempted to replace Vader an untold number of times, and only Luke, decades later, came remotely close. Vader simply was the ultimate apprentice. Even with his failure on Mustafar, he was Maul's future and Dooku's present, combined and amplified 1,000-fold. Here you go, folks. I've read some Reddit comments, and I'm more confused now than at the beginning of the video. Who's the most useful apprentice? Question mark, question mark, question mark. Well, that's the end of the video, though. Remember to like, comment, and as Palpatine says, subscribe.